The history of the Middle Ages is often painted with the golden brush of chivalry or the grim stroke of the Black Death. But hidden within the damp stone walls of monastery cellars and the frantic workshops of early scientists lies a much darker narrative. This was an era where the line between prayer and poison was razor-thin, and where the thirst for knowledge led men to commit acts that would make modern ethics boards recoil in horror. From the desperate search for the elixir of life to the gruesome anatomical theaters of the late medieval period, here is the dark, documented truth behind the experiments that shaped and scarred human history. The alchemist's blood price in the 14th century, the pursuit of alchemy was not just a hobby. It was an obsession fueled by the fear of mortality. While many know of the quest to turn lead into gold, few realize the biological price paid in the shadows. Take, for instance, the case of Gilles de Rais, a comrade in arms of Joan of Arc. While a decorated war hero, his private life was a descent into madness. Driven by a desire to summon demonic entities and discover the Philosopher's Stone, de Rais turned his castle into a laboratory of horrors. He believed that the vital essence required for his transmutations could only be found in the blood and organs of the innocent. His experiments were not merely murders. They were systematic attempts to see how the human soul reacted to prolonged suffering. He kept detailed notes, now lost to history's fires, of his failures to extract a magical tincture from human remains. When he was finally captured in 1440, the evidence found in his dungeons changed the way the world viewed the scholarly pursuit of alchemy forever. The forbidden language, the silence of children, one of the most chilling experimental trends of the medieval mind, was the language deprivation experiment. King James IV of Scotland, and purportedly Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II before him, became obsessed with finding the natural language of man. The hypothesis was simple yet cruel. If a child were raised without ever hearing a human word, what language would they naturally speak? Would it be Hebrew, the language of God, Latin, or perhaps Greek? To test this, infants were taken from their mothers and handed over to mutes or isolated in silent chambers. They were fed and kept clean, but no one was permitted to speak, hum, or even sigh in their presence. The result, the experiments were a catastrophic failure. Instead of speaking the tongue of angels, the children either died from what we now recognize as failure to thrive, extreme emotional neglect, or remained entirely nonverbal, communicating only through grunts and screams. It was a dark lesson in the fact that human connection is as vital to our survival as bread and water. The Black Death and the science of terror when the bubonic plague decimated Europe in 1347, the medical experts of the day were pushed to the brink of insanity. With no understanding of germs, they turned to radical, often lethal, experiments to stop the miasma. The fire walls in Avignon. Pope Clement VI was kept safe by his physicians who forced him to sit between two massive, roaring fires in the heat of summer. The experiment was meant to purify the air. Paradoxically, it worked, not because of the magic of fire, but because the extreme heat kept the plague-carrying fleas away from the Pope's person. The Theriac trials, doctors began mixing Theriac, a medical concoction containing up to 80 ingredients, including ground-up vipers and opium. They would test these on condemned prisoners, intentionally infecting them with plague or poison to see if the potion held. The volunteers rarely survived the treatment, let alone the disease. The resurrectionists, early anatomy before the Renaissance fully bloomed, the study of the human body was strictly forbidden by the Church. To understand the machine of God, early anatomists had to become grave robbers. In the late medieval universities of Italy, a dark trade emerged. Professors would hire resurrection men to snatch the bodies of the recently deceased. These bodies were then taken to secret anatomical theaters, often cramped, candle-lit basements smelling of vinegar and rot. Here, the experiment was simple: validation. They sought to prove if the ancient texts of Galen, who only dissected monkeys, were correct about humans. They found to their horror that they weren't. These illegal dissections were the first time the human heart, lungs, and brain were truly seen for what they were. But it required a stomach for the macabre and a complete disregard for the sanctity of the dead. The Iron Maiden, and the science of pain, we cannot discuss medieval experiments without the dark evolution of torture as an inquiry. In the medieval legal mind, truth was something that could be physically extracted. The Inquisition and various royal courts experimented with mechanical engineering to create devices that would break the will without killing the subject instantly. The experiment was to find the exact threshold of human endurance. They developed the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and specialized needles to find witch marks, spots on the body supposedly insensitive to pain. This was a pseudoscience of agony. They believed that by subjecting the flesh to extreme stress, the soul would be forced to vomit out its secrets. It was a dark intersection of theology, law, and crude mechanics. The legacy of the shadows, the dark truth, behind these experiments is that they were not performed by villains in the way we see them in movies. They were performed by the most educated, the most powerful, and the most pious men of their time. They were desperate to understand a world that was killing them with disease, famine, and mystery. In their misguided, often blood-soaked attempts to find the truth, they laid the messy, ethical-less foundation for what would eventually become modern science. They learned what not to do, and they proved that the human spirit, while fragile, is the most complex mystery of all. The damp walls of those medieval laboratories have mostly crumbled, but the echoes of those silent children and the ghosts of the alchemists still linger in the footnotes of our history books, a reminder of the price humanity has paid for its curiosity. The anatomical theater of the damned by the late 1400s, the church's grip on the sanctity of the human body began to slip, but only for the dishonorable dead. Executed criminals became the primary subjects for a new, grisly form of public experiment, the public dissection. These were not quiet medical procedures. They were theatrical events, often held during the carnival season to ensure the cold weather preserved the subject, the experiment. Doctors like Mondino de Luzzi would sit in a high chair, the cathedra, reading from ancient texts, while a sector, a butcher or barber surgeon, sliced open the body. The dark reality, because they were trying to match the body to 1,000-year-old, and often incorrect, books if they found an organ that didn't match the description. They assumed the body was deformed, not that the book was wrong. It was an experiment in forced confirmation bias. The Trepanning trials, releasing the demon's mental illness in the Middle Ages, was rarely seen as a biological issue. It was a spiritual one. However, the cure was a brutal physical experiment known as trepanning. Physicians believed that stones of folly or trapped vapors were causing madness or epilepsy. To test this theory, they used a T-shaped drill to bore holes directly into the patient's skull while they were fully conscious. The survival rate. Surprisingly, archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived multiple holes. The dark truth, this wasn't surgery. It was a desperate experiment to see if the soul could be balanced by altering the pressure of the brain. If the patient died, it was blamed on the demons being too strong. If they lived and likely suffered brain damage, they were seen as humbled by God. The toxicology of the royals. The human guinea pigs in the royal courts of Europe and the Middle East, the fear of poisoning was a constant paranoia. This led to the creation of the king's taster, but it went deeper than just tasting food. Royal alchemists conducted controlled experiments with arsenic, belladonna, and hemlock. They would feed small, increasing doses to prisoners to find the Mithridatic limit, the point where the body becomes immune to poison. The result, these experiments were the birth of toxicology. However, the data was bought with the agonizing deaths of hundreds of nameless convicts who were watched by court physicians as their nervous systems collapsed. Also, a king could feel safe drinking his wine. The drowned man experiments in coastal medieval Europe, particularly around the 13th century. There was a morbid fascination with the threshold between life and death. When sailors or travelers were pulled from the water, they were often still warm but not breathing. Medieval resuscitators experimented with truly bizarre methods to shock the soul back into the body. 1. The smoke bellows. They would literally blow tobacco smoke later in history, or acrid herbal fumes into the person's rectum, believing the heat and irritation would jumpstart the heart. 2. The bell ringing, placing the person inside a massive church bell and ringing it to vibrate the life back into them. 3. The salt burial, covering the body in hot salt to draw out the water of death. While these seem comical today, they were the first experimental attempts at CPR, born from a dark curiosity about where the spirit goes when the lungs stop moving. Summary of medieval experimental tools: experiment, type, goal, subject, modern, legacy, alchemy, immortality, gold, blood, mercury, chemistry, trepanning, curing, madness. The mentally ill neurosurgery deprivation finding, God's language, infants developmental psychology vivisection, mapping the body criminal's anatomy, the final. Mystery, the dancing plague. Experiments, perhaps the strangest historical experiment, happened in 1518 in Strasbourg, when hundreds of people began dancing uncontrollably until they died of exhaustion. The experiment, conducted by the city authorities, was to force them to dance more. They built a stage and hired musicians, theorizing that the overheated blood needed to be danced out of the system. It was a massive, citywide social experiment that resulted in dozens of heart attacks and strokes. It proved that even the most logical, medieval minds could be swept up in a collective madness. The homunculus, the jar-born nightmare in the hidden laboratories of the 15th century alchemists, a new obsession took hold. They weren't just looking for gold anymore, they wanted to play God. The experiment was to create a homunculus, a miniature, fully formed human being grown in a flask. The recipe, documents attributed to the alchemist Paracelsus, described a process that sounds like a fever dream. It involved sealing human vital fluid, semen, inside a glass phial, burying it in warm horse manure for 40 days, and feeding it with a constant infusion of human blood. The experiment, the goal was to see if life could be generated without a womb. These scientists spent decades staring at rotting jars, convinced that the tiny movements they saw in the murky fluid were the beginnings of a new race of servants. The horror, while they never succeeded in creating life, the psychological toll was immense. Alchemists often went mad, claiming the beings in the jars spoke to them, revealing secrets of the future. It was the first recorded bioengineering experiment, fueled by a dark rejection of natural birth. The dead man's hand, and the science of invisibility. Medieval experimentation wasn't always about medicine. Sometimes it was about applied criminality. In the late 1400s, a strange experiment circulated among the underworld of Europe, the Hand of Glory. The procedure: to create a tool that could paralyze anyone who saw it. Criminals and rogue physicians would experiment on the corpses of hanged men. They would surgically remove the left hand, drain it of blood, and pickle it in a mixture of salt, niter, and long peppers. The trial: they would then turn the fingers into candles made from the fat of the same hanged man. The experiment was to see if the metaphysical resonance of a sudden death could be captured in the flesh to create a literal magical blackout. The reality: while it sounds like pure folklore, the experiments to create these hands were documented in judicial records. It shows a society that viewed the human body as a battery of energy, one that could be harvested and manipulated through scientific preservation. The plague doctors. The experiment of the mask. We often see the iconic bird-masked plague doctor as a symbol of the Black Death. But the mask itself was a failed scientific experiment in filtration. The hypothesis: doctors believed the plague was miasma, bad air. The mask was an experimental respirator. The beak was stuffed with over 50 different types of herbs, dried flowers, and spices, like cloves and rose petals. The test: doctors would walk into death houses full of rotting corpses, believing the scent of the herbs would neutralize the poison in the air. The failure: the experiment failed because the plague was carried by fleas, not smells. The leather robes they wore actually attracted fleas, turning the doctors into mobile carriers. They were inadvertently experimenting on themselves, and the results were almost always fatal. The screaming mandrake, botanical torture. Medieval botany was just as dark as its anatomy. The mandrake root, which vaguely resembles a human figure, was the subject of intense field experiments. The myth experiment: it was believed that the root would scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. To test this safely, medieval herbalists devised a mechanical experiment. They would tie a dog to the plant, walk a safe distance away, and blow a horn to startle the dog into pulling the root. The data, they kept meticulous records of which dogs survived and which screams were the loudest. This wasn't just superstition. It was a crude attempt to understand the defensive mechanisms of nature. It led to the discovery of the plant's actual properties, scopolamine and atropine, which they then experimented with as the first surgical anesthetics. The evolution of the secret science. By the time the 1500s arrived, these dark experiments had created a massive underground network of knowledge. Dark experiment the magic. View the scientific truth blood transfusion, transferring the soul. Blood types circulation, the hand of glory, invisibility, paralysis, preservation, embalming mandrake. Harvesting demonic screams, alkaloid toxicity, homunculus, artificial life embryology. Germ theory, the silent transition, the dark truth, is that the Middle Ages didn't end because people suddenly became smart. It ended because these horrific experiments finally hit a wall. The alchemists realized that blood didn't create gold. The doctors realized that holes in the head didn't cure demons. And the kings realized that tasting poison didn't make them immortal. But the scars remained. The basement laboratories of Europe were the birthplaces of our modern world. We are the children of those who survived the fire, the plague, and the beak of the doctor. The final chapter of this dark history moves from the physical body to the experimentation on the mind and the manipulation of the senses. As the Renaissance began to dawn, the scientists of the late medieval period realized that the most powerful laboratory wasn't a basement or a jar. It was the human perception of reality. This led to the era of the alchemical wedding and the shadow pharmacies. The witch's flying ointment, the first psychotropic experiments long before modern pharmacology. Medieval occultists and village healers were conducting high-stakes clinical trials on the human nervous system. They sought a way to leave the physical body, what they called flying to the Sabbath. The experiment, they harvested plants from the Solanaceae family, belladonna, deadly nightshade, mandrake, and henbane. These contain powerful alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine. The method, because ingesting these plants often led to immediate death by heart failure, they experimented with transdermal absorption. They mixed the herbs with animal fat to create an ointment. The discovery. They found that applying this grease to thin-skinned areas of the body allowed the chemicals to enter the bloodstream slowly. The result, the subjects didn't fly. They experienced vivid, terrifying hallucinations of flight and demonic transformation. This was a dark, undocumented science of anesthesiology and neurology. They were mapping the brain's ability to hallucinate, though they recorded it as spiritual travel. The green lion and the mercury madness in the quest for the universal solvent, the azoth. Alchemists began experimenting heavily with mercury. They called it the green lion because of its ability to devour other metals. The experiment, alchemists would spend years in unventilated rooms, heating mercury over open flames to observe its vapors. They believed that by inhaling the spirit of the metal, they could purify their own blood. The data, they meticulously recorded the symptoms of their transformation. Trembling hands, loss of teeth, and divine visions, hallucinations. The reality, they were documenting mercury poisoning in real time. The Mad Hatter syndrome wasn't a spiritual awakening, it was the literal melting of the nervous system. These men were the first human test subjects for heavy metal toxicity, sacrificing their sanity for a chemical dream. The sympathetic powder, experimenting with distance in the late 1500s, a strange medical theory emerged that sounds like quantum entanglement. The powder of sympathy. The hypothesis, if a person was wounded by a sword, you didn't treat the person, you treated the sword. The experiment, physicians would take the weapon that caused the injury, smear it with secret salves, and keep it warm and clean. They believed the vital spirits connected the blade to the wound across any distance. The dark twist, surprisingly, many patients improved during these trials. The scientific truth, this was the first unintentional experiment in sterilization. By treating the sword and leaving the wound alone, instead of packing it with dung or dirty rags as was common, the body's natural immune system finally had a chance to heal. It was a breakthrough born from a total misunderstanding of reality. The end of the Dark Ages, the great reckoning. As we look back at the dark truth behind medieval experiments, we see a pattern of sacrifice. The infants who were silenced to find God's language taught us about the necessity of love. The prisoners who died of plague potions taught us about the limits of the human heart. The alchemists who went mad in mercury clouds gave us the periodic table. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of ignorance. They were a time of wild, unregulated curiosity. These men and women were willing to walk into the dark with a single candle, even if that candle was made from the fat of a dead man. Final comparison, then versus. Now medieval gold, the dark experiment, modern reality, eternal youth drinking, gold, and blood stem cell research, divine vision, belladonna ointments, neuropsychopharmacology, transmutation, forging the philosopher's stone, nuclear physics, resurrection, the drowned man, bellows, advanced life support / CPR. The legacy of these experiments lives on in every pill we take and every surgery we undergo. We have simply replaced the candlelit basement with a sterile white room and the demon with a virus. But the hunger to know the dark truth remains exactly the same.